Are you ready to make it rain? Learn from the best in the biz on how to take your business to the next level. You're now entering the growth zone on the Guts and Glory Show with your host, Louise Scott.
Hey guys, welcome to the Guts and Glory Show. My name is Luis. I am your host, and I'm really excited for you to be here to talk about the 5 ways to monetize your podcast. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I have had my podcast for several years, and I was not always as consistent as I needed to be because I didn't really understand the game. I didn't understand how you actually made money doing a podcast, or how do you actually get people to pay you for something? Like I didn't understand the concept, and the team that I was working with, it's a great team, and I'm very, very happy with them and happy with what they've been able to do for me. And they were explaining the process, and they would tell me what I needed to do, but I understood kind of like in theory, but conceptually, I didn't really know how you transition. And so this year I decided I was going to go out and I was going to actually put out some shows and try to do one a week. And that became very difficult, especially as it related to me bringing guests, because I have a very busy schedule. So scheduling guests became problematic, even though if I put a little bit more time into the process, it's very likely I would have been able to schedule guests without any issue. But I kept telling myself that I didn't have the time to do it. And but nevertheless, I think I'm going to finish the year doing about 30 shows. But I want to talk to you about how you make money from a podcast, because many people don't understand its importance. And recently I was a guest on a podcast. Now, one thing that I have been able to successfully do is to become a guest on people's podcasts. People reach out to me independently. Now, I did use an agent to get me on some podcasts, but I have now people reaching out to me independently to come speak on podcasts. So I did get that. But the question is, how do you use your podcast? How do you leverage your own podcast to actually make money? And that's what people want to do. You know, I hear about people who have podcast shows, and we're not talking about the Joe Rogans of the world. We're talking about, you know, simple, ordinary, average Joe people who don't have massive followings on social media, who are leveraging their podcast for 7 figures in revenue. You heard that right. There are people who are leveraging their podcast for 7 figures in revenue, but that's because they have a strategy for their podcast. And so that's what we're going to be talking about, is how do you take your show into a monetizing phase? And now I can say, looking back, which I didn't really understand the concept, but it somewhat happened organically over the last 3 years. My podcast, in conjunction with other things, so it's not just the podcast, but my podcast in conjunction with other things, has led to 7 figures in revenue for me. And so I want to talk to you about how you do that. How do you go from this idea, the concept of having a show, to then using the show to actually monetize and make money? And I'm not going to get into the basics of starting a podcast. There's a lot of material and content out there that you can find on how to start a podcast, but it's super simple. I mean, you set up a web Zoom camera, you get a nice microphone, and you just start talking. Now, there's a couple of different ways. You can do like a solo podcast, which is what I traditionally do, even though I have guests every once in a while, or you can do a podcast with guests. And either one, it just depends on your style, your ability. If you use guests, it allows you to leverage other people, which is really good. And that's going to be one of the points that I have here for monetizing your podcast. But using guests allows you to leverage their network, right? Because if you bring me on, I have a network that likes listening to me, and so you instantaneously have a new audience. Whereas if it's just you have to carry the entire burden, the entire weight of the podcast. So that's something strategical that you probably need to figure out before you get started. But the biggest point, before I go into the 5 points of monetizing your podcast, the number one biggest point is you need to have a strategy for making money. If you're going to start a podcast and you want to make money, you need to have a strategy for making money. Like, what is it that the podcast is going to lead to? Is the podcast going to lead to advertising? Is the podcast going to lead to consulting and so forth? And I don't want to give away all the secrets, but what is it going to lead to? What's the strategy behind your podcast? Or are you just trying to create a show and awareness, and one day the show becomes big? That's going to be a long journey, right? Because becoming a celebrity podcast person takes some time. And so you really want to ask yourself the question, what is this podcast going to lead to? So let's get into how I've been able to monetize, and how you will be able to monetize your podcast so that you can make as much money as you possibly can. And by the way, I have a friend of mine who started a podcast, which is actually a really good podcast. And it's It's a great show, and it's funny, it's entertaining, but he started the podcast to do this first strategy, and it's been working out for him. He told me he's making multiple six figures through his podcast because of this strategy. But the first way to monetize your podcast, and it's something that I did, is it increase your network and your connections. If you want to grow your income, one of the most underappreciated and undervalued skill sets is building a bigger network. When you have a bigger network, when more people know you, when more people have heard of you, when more people know what you stand for, when more people understand your work ethic, it's more likely that you're going to run into somebody who is willing to give you a shot. It's more likely that you're going to find investment partners. It's more likely that you're going to find investment dollars. It's more likely that you're going to find someone who's willing to promote you and become a super fan. I have several super fans. I have people who text me and they say, "Hey, I got your book, bought 20 copies of the book. I want to share it." And so you're going to have some super fans in this process, and you want to be able to increase your network and connections. So one of the ways that you increase your network and your connections is by inviting people onto your podcast. So that's strategy number one. So if you want to make more money from your podcast, and you don't have the weight of your authority to back you up, meaning you're not a Joe Rogan, you're not, one of these really, really big Gary V's or something where you already have the weight of your show, where people listen to your show regardless of anything. If you're not one of those people, then you probably want to bring guests who have some sort of credibility, and they call it, the one level up rule, right? And so you want to make sure that you're bringing on guests that are one level above you. And so think about it like this: if you are, a six-figure professional, one level above you would be somebody who makes $500,000 or more in their business. If you're making $500,000, one level up would be somebody who has $1 million. Think about it in following. If you have 10,000 followers, one level up is somebody who has 20,000 followers. If you have 20, somebody who has 100. If you have 100, somebody who has 500. So you want to level up. And the reason is because you're going to continuously increase your circle. And as you increase your circle, opportunities present themselves. Recently I was talking to my financial advisor, and he was telling me the story of how, the Rockefellers and the Kennedys and so forth, how they became wealthy and what they do with certain financial instruments. And I was just blown away. Like, if you don't get into the circle with the people that understand that system, you'll never be able to have the financial resources that they have. And I mean, some of the strategies, and this is not a financial show, so I'm not going to divulge some of the strategies, but some of the strategies that he shared with me were, they just blew my mind. Almost hard to believe. And it's because I've elevated my network over the years that has now put me into the circles where I can have those conversations. So you want to bring people on your show. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, I wasn't good at this. And the reason is because I don't know. I have a hard time scheduling people, and I have a hard time like getting people on the show. And I didn't want to ask people. I mean, that's my fault, right? But if you're starting your show and you want to access people's immediate network, imagine you doing a show, you're doing 52 shows in a year. You bring on 52 guests, and every one of these guests has some sort of network, right? And they have 1,000 people. You're more likely going to be put into front, of 52,000 people. And so bringing on people to your show is a great way to monetize your podcast. You're going to be able to network with people. You're going to increase your connections, and furthermore, you're going to be able to access some of the intellectual property that they have. And by that, I don't mean like their written intellectual property, but the things that are in their head. And there's nothing better than learning from other people. And so I love being able to bring people on the show and do that. I don't do it often, but like I said, that's one way that I've been able to monetize my podcast. And also one of the things that I do is I also try to sell them on the consulting services. Number two is trying to get speaking gigs. So for me, I wanted to be a nationally renowned author and speaker. Well, having a podcast is a great way to communicate to the masses, even if the masses is 500 to 1,000 people, and get your name out there. It creates assets.
This show has been brought to you by 8-Figure Firm Consulting. At 8-Figure Firm, we help law firms turn into law businesses. Stop wasting your time with gurus who've never built a successful business. At 8-Figure Firm, we'll show you how to unleash the power of your law firm for personal and financial freedom. For more information, go to 8figurefirm.com. Welcome back to the Guts and Glory Show with your host, Luis Scott.
So we talk about these speaking assets. So I can create this podcast, chop it up into little segments, and then I can promote those segments through my email campaigns and also through social media, and create the persona of being a speaker. Now, one of the things that I did is I had to set my price. So I set my price at $10,000 for a speaking gig. And I've now been booked a couple of times for these speaking gigs to go fly and talk to a particular company about their for their business. And so the podcast has been able to monetize. It hasn't made a lot, right? So I'm not going to say that I've made 6 figures or that I've made 7 figures doing speaking, but I haven't given it the full effort. It's just been kind of a marginal effort to get speaking gigs out there. So speaking is another way that you can monetize your podcast. You use your podcast as a stepping stone to speaking. You use your podcast to get in front of the audience. You use your podcast as creating assets. You use your podcast so that you can differentiate yourself and distinguish yourself as a speaker. And so that's the second thing that I've done. So I've made money off speaking as well. The next thing is selling courses and events. Again, this goes back to your strategy. We developed a course, and I should say selling courses, events, and books. So my book has sold, 3 or 4 copies, maybe 6 copies a day for the last year. And so every day we're selling books and selling more books. And so we developed something called the 9 Principles of Exponential Growth course. It's $199. You can learn how to grow your business by paying $199, super cheap, not a big deal. We also have events. We sell events for what we call our mastermind. The last mastermind we had, I believe, 12 or 14 attendees at $1,500 a piece. So when you think about that, that's, I don't know, if you do that 3 times a year, let's say 12 attendees 3 times a year, that's 3,600 times, let's call it $1,000. $1,500 would be somewhere around, I don't know, you're about $45,000-$50,000. So just in selling events, we made about $45,000. So another way is to sell courses, events, and books. I've done all 3 of those, and it's been very, very successful. Again, not 6 figures, not 7 figures, but it's been successful enough to where it justifies the expense of doing the podcast. The fourth way is consulting. Now, this is what you see really in the space. If most podcasts outside of the big ones, they sell consulting services. Massive way to make money. And in that regard, I've made multiple 7 figures selling consulting services using the podcast. Now, not all of it has come through the podcast, right? I mentioned you have to take the podcast, you have to break it up into email campaigns and social media. So we'd spent a lot of money on social media. We spent a lot of money on email campaigns. We hosted these events. I do a LinkedIn webinar. There's a lot of things, but the podcast gives you a little bit of credibility. And the podcast, you can use the assets from your show in order to sell consulting services. And it really expands your show because people see that you're an author. They see that you have a podcast. So you're just kind of connecting them with multiple assets and resources. So consulting has been a big one. And the thing is, you don't have to sell 7 figures of consulting. If you have a unique way to help somebody grow a business and you sell it at $5,000 per month, 2 of those, and you're making $120,000, you're already in the top, 7% of income earners in the country just by selling 2 clients per month using your podcast. So a lot of opportunity on the consulting side as it relates to, to making a lot of money. And then the last way is to grow your audience and get advertisers. And this is something that I've had people approach me on. I haven't pulled the trigger on it yet, but I've had a couple of software companies who want to sell to my clientele, who have asked if they can advertise on my podcast. They've offered me $10,000, $15,000. And I've so far rejected it, but just because I don't want to be tied to any particular vendor at the moment. So I've hit all 5 of these. You can hit all 5 of these. You can go network and connect, increase your circle. You can get speaking engagements. You can sell courses, events, and books, consulting services. You can grow your audience, get advertisers on your podcast. And if you just add all those up, let's just say you make, 15, 20,000 off each one. Now you have a 6-figure podcast, which is what we've done. We actually have a multi-7-figure podcast show, plus social media, plus events, plus consulting, and it all works together. But the biggest thing is you got to put the time in, you got to put the energy in, you got to put the effort in. It's not going to happen overnight. It's taken me 3 years to really get here. And, but it's still a good deal because I'm not tied to any particular, job or business or anything like that. I've now created my own brand, and that is powerful within itself, right? Once you create your own brand, you can stand on your own. You don't have to worry about other people paying for you because you're going to have just you're going to have tons and tons of people who are paying for you, who are getting you, out there and who are helping you grow your personal brand. So those are 5 ways to monetize your podcast. If you're trying to figure out how to make more money off your podcast, try these. I'm telling you, it can be 6 figures or more for you if you just dedicate the time, energy, and effort to it. And I wish you good luck. And thank you again for listening to the Guts and the Glory Show.
You've been listening to the Guts and Glory Show. For more and to learn more about Luis, hit the website at luisscottjr.com. For consulting opportunities, hit 8figurefirm.com. That's the number 8figurefirm.com. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and we'll see you next time on the Guts and Glory Show.